tissue consists of cells located in a sea of extracellular material known as the extracellular matrix. And this matrix consists of fluids and something known as ground substance, which is basically a jelly-like material that fills all the spaces between the cells. Within this ground substance, there are lots and lots of embedded fibers, such as collagen, which is actually stronger than steel and is that very same stuff that some people inject into their faces to plump up. Elastic fibers, which allow our tissues to stretch and recoil like a rubber band. And reticular fibers, which form a meshwork of spongy material which holds everything in place. And these all help determine the physical properties of the particular type of connective tissue. So when comparing epithelia with connective tissue, one major difference between them is the relative abundance of this extracellular material, as well as the fibers seen in connective tissue, but fewer cells by volume. The primary function of connective tissue is to provide structure and support, as well as to connect or bind our tissues together, just as its name suggests. It also works to provide protection to our body, as well as insulation to our other tissues and organs. And some types of connective tissue also have a role in storage of energy, as well as working as a transport system within our body. Of course, since there are lots of different types of connective tissue, there are equally lots of different types of cell types specific to each particular type of connective tissue. They do, however, share some common features and generally can be divided into two major types: immature connective tissue cells and mature connective tissue cells. So immature cells are pretty easy to recognize by their names because they end in the suffix blast. For example, fibroblasts in proper connective tissue, chondroblasts in cartilage, osteoblasts in bone, lipoblasts in your fat tissues, and even hemocytoblasts in your blood. And despite what their names might suggest, these cells are not involved in blowing anything up. In fact, it's quite the contrary. Among their many functions is to secrete the ground substance and fibers needed to build up their related connective tissue. And once they've done their job, producing extracellular matrix amongst many other things, they transition into their mature form, which tend to be less active and sometimes described as resting. These cell types give up their blast surname and instead end up with the suffix -cyte. So our fibroblasts turn into fibrocytes, our chondroblasts into chondrocytes, our osteoblasts into osteocytes, and so on. These cells can sometimes revert back into immature form, should they need to repair and rebuild tissue, but in general they function to maintain the tissue built by its progenitor blast cell. So these are the cells that make and maintain your blood, ligaments, cartilage, and bone, and basically everything that holds you together, and ensures that you don't look like a giant blob of jello. Now, that's not the end of the story when it comes to the cell types in connective tissue. There's another class of cell types which aren't involved in building connective tissue, but rather work to protect you from, well, everything really. And these are your immune cells, such as macrophages and white blood cells like neutrophils, eosinophils, monocytes, and lymphocytes, and the list goes on. These guys are like the Army, the Marines, the Navy SEALs, and the FBI of your body, all combined, who scout your connective tissues, fighting off invaders and external threats. So let's take a closer look now at some of the different types of connective tissue. So there are three groupings of connective tissue based on the type of extracellular matrix present: tissues with liquid matrices, tissues with semi-solid matrices, and tissues with solid matrices. So first we have that one of the connective tissue types are tissues with liquid matrices. And one of the most significant connective tissues with liquid matrices in the body is one of the key liquids of the cardiovascular system, and that is blood. And blood is composed of red blood cells, called erythrocytes, and white blood cells, called leukocytes. And these cells are contained by a liquid matrix called the plasma. In this micrograph, you can see the erythrocytes as reddish-brown discs, and there's one leukocyte example present in this image, and that's the one that's circled and then shown in our breakout. And note that the dark green area represents the cell nucleus. The red blood cells don't have this dark purple staining that's shown in the non-highlighted leukocyte in the circle to the left because they're anuclear, meaning that they do not possess a nucleus. And in this image, the small purple dots, like this one here, are platelets, which aid in blood clot formation. And as we mentioned, there are a few types of connective tissue with semi-solid matrices, which are commonly referred to connective tissue proper. And the first of these is a tissue that we'll call loose connective tissue, and this type of tissue can be found in three primary forms, the first of which is known as areolar tissue. Areolar tissue is widespread throughout the body and can often be found deep to the basement membrane of the epithelium. It contains a meshwork of collagen and elastin fibers and is therefore very flexible. Loose connective tissue is also the site of rapid fluid and gaseous exchange between tissues. The second type of loose connective tissue is known as reticular connective tissue, which acts like a scaffold in certain tissues, providing other cell types with a home to mature or to develop. And you'll find reticular connective tissue in structures like your lymph nodes, your spleen, and bone marrow. One last type of loose connective tissue is adipose tissue, which to you and me is aka fat tissue. It's a unique type of connective tissue because unlike the others, it doesn't have much extracellular material and is instead mostly cellular. Adipose tissue typically can be found encasing organs or other structures, and it's made up of fat cells called adipocytes. Adipose tissue can be found all over the body, including subcutaneously. But before you go cursing your adipose tissue for fear of a dreaded potbelly and love handles in the correct amounts, it is actually an extremely important tissue in our body because it provides insulation to protect us from excessive heat loss. And it also provides protection for our organs, such as our heart and kidneys. And finally, and most critically, fat is our fuel tank, a calorie reserve that keeps our body ticking over during extended periods without food intake. During fixation and staining, the fat contained in adipocytes is removed, leaving them empty in appearance with the nucleus at the periphery, which as you can see, gives them a very distinct ring-like appearance in the histological section. So we're moving on now to our second kind of connective tissue with semi-solid matrices, which is loose connective tissue's cousin, dense connective tissue. And as we can tell from the name, dense connective tissue is more dense than loose connective tissue. And just like loose connective tissue, dense connective tissue has three main subtypes. The first is dense regular connective tissue, which you're looking at now on your screen. And this type of tissue contains more collagen than elastin and presents an organized or regular arrangement of fibers, which provides it with greater strength. This tissue forms strong tissues such as ligament and tendon, which you can see now on your screen. The second type of dense connective tissue is known as dense irregular connective tissue, dermis, which is mostly found in the dermis of the skin. And as you can see, it has a more haphazard arrangement compared to its tendinous and ligamentous cousins. The final type of dense connective tissue is known as elastic connective tissue, which, true to its name, is full of elastic fibers, which allow it to stretch and recoil. A good example of elastic connective tissue is that found in your large elastic arteries, just like you can see here in this micrograph.